Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chatham House. My name is Beyza Ünal. I'm a Senior Research Fellow in the International Security Department at Chatham House. Initially, Deborah Haynes from Sky News was going to chair the meeting, but she had an emergency, so I needed to step in. If I do any rookie mistakes, so apologies from the very beginning. I learned that I'm going to chair in the last 2 hours. In a second, I'm going to introduce the speakers to you. Today, we're going to discuss the integration of women in the armed forces, an issue area that has been neglected for over years from the military discussion. In the couple of years, a dynamic change has been taking place in some of the European countries, along with Canada and the United States. For instance, in the United Kingdom, as of October 2018, women serving in the army could take infantry roles. In Israel, 70% of the Karakal battalion, which is an infantry combat battalion, is women. In Norway, since 1985, women have been able to access all positions as men, including combat positions. Thus, in this panel, the speakers are going to discuss the international landscape of women's involvement in armed forces worldwide. I'm very fortunate today to be with 3 exceptional speakers. From the sitting order on my left, we have Heloise Goodley. Heloise is the Army Fellow at Chatham House. She's commissioned into the Army in 2007, having worked for the previous 5 years in London as a management consultant as well. She has deployed twice to Afghanistan, serving with the British forces and also the US Marine Corps, and also deployed in support of the NATO mission in Libya. Welcome, Heloise. In the middle seat, we have Kjersti Klæbo. Kjersti is the Director General of the Department for Competence and Joint Legal Services in the Norwegian Ministry of Defense since 2012. In her work, Kjersti instrumented an education reform in Norway. In addition, universal conscription was introduced during her stewardship in 2015. Welcome, we're really honored. Next to Kjersti, we have Johan Lawson. Johan is a Senior Research Fellow for Military Influence at the Royal United Services Institute, also known as RUSI. He works on armed conflict, military influence, and information operations, among other issues. Johan has previously a Royal Air Force officer, initially as a policing and security specialist, but in more recent years in a range of joint warfare appointments that he had taken. Now, before the discussion starts, let me make a few important remarks. This event will be on the record, so it's not going to be under the Chatham House rule. When you address questions, just be aware of that. You can comment via Twitter using hashtag #CHEvents, CH in capital. And I ask all the attendees to put your phones on silence, please. Now, I would like to turn to the speakers and start perhaps with Heloise. Can you please talk to us about what are the challenges and opportunities that you see today in integrating women in the armed forces? A bit of a general overview for us.
Yes, of course. Okay, thank you very much, Beyza, and good afternoon, and thank you all for coming along today. I think it's quite useful to start the discussion by knowing that back in 2016, when the Prime Minister announced that the UK would be lifting its ban on women serving in ground close combat roles, the UK was actually one of the last remaining members of NATO still to prohibit the employment of women in these occupations. So there is already a wealth of experience from other nations on the challenges presented on integrating women in combat roles, particularly from countries like Canada and Norway and Sweden, who have had women in these roles for nearly 30 years. And I want to start by exploring one of the findings from the Canadian experience. So Canada opened ground close combat roles 29 years ago to women, and initially it wasn't very successful. So they commissioned a review into why. And one of the interesting findings that came out of this review was the requirement to address the more subtle institutional barriers to integration. For example, the use of equipment and the design of clothing. And in Canada, like most NATO countries, they now have female-cut military uniform. And while wearing uniform designed for men doesn't limit women's ability to perform their roles, it is a subtle daily reminder that they're an afterthought and that they're simply bolted on rather than fully belonging to the organisation. And I can give you a personal experience of this that happened to me very recently. I was on a range firing a mini flare. And actually, I've never fired a live mini flare because in training, we typically use a training flare. And I realised that I couldn't perform the recognised firing procedure to do this, which is holding the flare in one hand and using your thumb to pull the trigger. And it's because my hand span is too small and I didn't have sufficient leverage to do this. And as I stood on the range, getting increasingly frustrated that I couldn't do this, I had another one of these subtle reminders that I'm not really made for the army, or rather, the army's not really made for me. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that the army needs to go out and redesign all its equipment for women with small hands. After those sort of few moments of frustration, I realised that I just needed to adapt the recognised firing procedure, and I used two hands, and I fired off the flare perfectly adequately. But what we do need to do if we're going to accommodate women in the army is adopt a culture of integration, whereby women and men feel as though they're able to identify and raise these subtle barriers to integration in order that the required adaptations can be made. And this cultural shift is required because if these subtle barriers to integration remain unchallenged, then the male-dominated organisational culture will persist, perpetuating what Philip Hammond, when he was the Defence Secretary, called the last bastion of male chauvinism. And the benefits of actually including women in ground close combat will remain unfulfilled. And for the military to fully realise the benefits of women in its organisation, women need to feel as though they belong, but also they need to feel comfortable in who they are and how they're expected to act and perform as women in the infantry or in the cavalry or the Royal Armoured Corps. And this will involve negotiating a new identity that doesn't currently exist, and that is one of a female warrior. And that will be difficult to negotiate when there aren't any other women as role models and mentors. For the women fulfilling these roles that have been traditionally occupied by men, they are going to be challenging the gendered norm, but they'll only be able to do that if they're allowed to perform the role in their own way, rather than merely adopting the male way. And to date, the identity of soldiering and combat soldiering has been defined by men. It is men who have set the established behaviours and practices and traits of the subculture. And women joining close combat units will, by their very nature, be challenging this. But if women just adopt the prevailing masculine soldier identity, it'll undermine one of the key arguments that the army has for their inclusion in ground close combat, and that is the benefits of increased diversity and operational effectiveness. In Norway and Sweden, they implemented something in an attempt to overcome this, and that was a mentoring program specifically for female recruits, whereby they appointed gender coaches and advisors. But actually, I think at the moment, the culture in the British military, this would be quite problematic. Largely because women in the military, in my own experience, are often quite reluctant to assume the role of mentor or role model. Because if you've made a point throughout your entire career of not being singled out for your gender, it takes some convincing to reverse this standpoint. And furthermore, women in the army are often, they're quite reluctant to turn to these resources, such as we have in the army, we have the Army Service Women's Network. And it's because they don't want to highlight themselves as different to the men and needing additional support. One of the lines I often hear in the army is that there's no Army Men's Servicemen's Network. And this is because this isn't as imperative, because the men have their network around them daily. And this brings me to one of the things that I think presents a real opportunity to the integration of women in close combat. And that is the notion of regendering the military. Something that feminists hoped would be achieved with the passing of UN Security Council Resolution 1325. Because the potential for women to disrupt the norms of military masculinity would help achieve the policy of gender mainstreaming that 1325 envisaged. And this is trying to break down the binary between what is masculine and what is feminine traits in peace and security. And what this would mean is that soldiering would no longer place a greater value on the masculine traits over feminine ones, but rather combine the two and be equally open to both. So soldiering would still be about being physically tough and brave and assertive, but it would also include being empathetic and sympathetic to local cultures, communicative, having humanity and warmth. And those are qualities that are traditionally viewed as feminine. So the ultimate goal here is not about a military where women do women's stuff and men are tough. It's actually one where both are combined to better resolving conflict. And this means that women need to be involved in those masculine activities, like ground close combat, in order to redefine them. Because the performative nature of gender means that if we successfully integrate women into ground close combat, then by the mere value of them performing those traditional masculine roles, they'll be challenging the attachment of them to men. And I think this ultimately will have a positive impact on the very nature and conduct of military operations.
Thank you very much, Louise. Good to hear actually the broad spectrum of issues, but also from the UK perspective. I would like to go to Kjersti now and learn a bit more about the Norwegian model, perhaps, and your reflections on the whole idea of the military culture and how Norway has established certain rules and norms.
Thank you so much. Let me first say that I'm really happy to be here. I'm great honored on behalf of the Norwegian Ministry of Defense to be able to come and speak to you about integration of women officers and soldiers in the Norwegian Armed Forces. Next one. The security situation facing NATO is challenging and unpredictable. A strong and even more self-assertive Russia, in combination with emerging security threats, demand that we focus on operational capability and collective defense. In order to do so, we must recruit the best and the most suited among the people in order to improve our armed forces. Personnel is the backbone of our defense forces, and without the best qualified and most motivated personnel, we will not be able to enhance our operational capability. Norwegian society, but not only Norwegian society, many countries are in the midst of growing female empowerment. Women are, at least in Norway, fully integrated into the workforce and into higher education. New role models are emerging. Social scientists call this femininization of society. And this is not limited only for Norway, it's valid in many places around the world. So we must consequently search for wider talent. The armed forces must pursue greater diversity in order to perform their tasks. They simply cannot afford not to. No modern competitive organization can leave out 50% of the intelligence resources. They would be very, very unwise to do so. Next. This seminar focuses on the concentration on the full integration of women into military combat roles. I'd like to draw your attention to the photograph. This is a photograph of Norwegian UN troops in patrol in Mali. And two questions can easily arise. Is this a potential combat situation? And what skills and training are required for them to do their job? Experiences in the field have taught us that this patrol may involve chatting with locals, but it can also involve retaliating against sniper, or both. So, in modern conflicts, the lines between the front and the rear have become seriously blurred. So, combat roles are found within many different specializations. So, recruiting soldiers with different background is therefore necessary. We need women and men who are willing and able to undergo training, to understand and assess the situation, to operate technology as well as exercise human skills. We need personnel with the necessary physical and psychological stamina, and with the ability to calm down the situation if that is possible. And all these characteristics can be found among women and among men. They are gender neutral characteristics. Next. So lessons have taught us that having women soldiers in operations lead to improved dialogue with and trust from the local population. Women soldiers lead to better situational awareness. They lead to better potential for de-escalation of the situation, and they lead to less likelihood of sexual abuse by soldiers. Conscription is historically rooted in a Norwegian society, and conscription has proven to be an effective recipe for capacity building and talent search across the genders. In 2015, the law to extend mandatory military conscription to women came into effect. And this means that the state no longer reserves military service to men. And this is a game changer, a real game changer. And what are the what do we witness so far? The military leadership reports that they sense a gradual shift in culture. They in units with full female integration, there is less tendency for sexual harassment, less gender-based prejudice, and more gender-sensitive leadership. In Norway, female and male conscripts share bedrooms. This has also proven to be a very effective means to reduce sexual harassment among the units. And also this has proven to be a success in Norway. We have non-tolerance for different spheres for women and men, and we have a non-tolerance for sexual harassment or abuse. Women must feel at home and welcome. And even though we only had 3 years of experience with universal conscription, I think I can already say that this has been a tremendous success. Now we must do our utmost to be able to keep the girls, the able and motivated girls that are now conscripts, and make sure that we convince at least a part of them to pursue a military career. It would be very sad if we lost this opportunity to increase the amount of women. Next, Hannah. So gender integration. Gender roles are part of culture, and cultural change takes time. Leaders can either make or break an initiative. So an increase in the number of women is by itself not enough, especially if women in the organization simply take on traditional women's tasks. We also need more female boots on the ground. And the need for good female role models is well known. Some, like Major General Kristin Lund, she was the first UN female force commander in 2014, and she's a well-established role model. But we even we need young role models. In Norway, we have a select group of female hunters among our special forces. And these female hunters, they have attracted a lot of female followers and applicants. So I think the final point I would like to make is that women in the armed forces must not be forced to choose between family life and work life. Because if they have to do so, we will lose out a lot of capable women. We therefore need to look into family-oriented initiatives that make it possible to combine a two-career family and military service, both for men and women. Norway still has work to do, but I am quite convinced that we are moving in the right direction and that we are seeing positive results and real change. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kjersti. I'm glad that you highlighted the key practices in Norway. This actually takes me back to you, Ann. And can you talk a little bit about the lessons learned that UK could take on board, perhaps, from the other practices that you have seen?
Okay, thanks, Beza. I think many of you will have seen what I would describe as a fairly tedious debate online about whether women in close combat roles is a good idea. I mean, not only is this actually a pretty pointless discussion because the decision's already been made, it's a sort of resistance to change that is really going to undermine, the future combat success of the UK military. However, I think more importantly, the complete integration of women in the armed forces is essential if we are to enhance societal resilience. And societal resilience, I will argue, is a key part of future efforts for the UK at modern deterrence. A little first about where some of my perspectives come from. Normally this is a pantomime booing point where I say, as has been mentioned, I'm a former RAF officer. But from the first day at Cranwell in the late 1980s, male and female officer cadets were completely and utterly integrated. We dug trenches, carried pine poles and pointless concrete-filled ammunition boxes over the Yorkshire moors and elsewhere together. Each flight of 10 of us included at least 2 female cadets, and there was no sense at any point of anyone being assessed to a different standard, well, apart perhaps from potential pilots, but that's a different story. My first productive tour was guarding nuclear weapons, and within a year of commissioning, women were completely integrated into this role, which was live armed at a time in the 1980s when live armed was not that common. Live armed with a rifle and 80 rounds of ammunition. That was 7.62 in the SLR. Those who are familiar with those weapons will know that's no easy carry for an average man, let alone for women being newly introduced into this business. And the expectation was, in the event of a hostile intrusion into the site where we were storing the weapons, we would be expected to close with and kill the enemy, the language of close combat. I do recognise that's not quite the same as being a Royal Marine and yomping across the Falklands, but there are parallels here. And this has been happening in this country for 30 years. And I do think we perhaps sometimes need to accentuate some of the positives and build on that experience. Subsequently in my career, as I became a bit more of a jack of all trades, my experience in Africa particularly highlighted the need for a greater involvement of women in peacekeeping, but also in peace building. Some of the things that both the previous speakers have referred to, and indeed, you know, those who have looked at Eloise's career will know about her time in the DRC. The fact that female engagement teams came to us so late in the day in Afghanistan, I think says something about our failure to really recognise the importance of engaging with the whole of society. It's very easy, I think, to argue, well, it's a male-dominated society, but actually if your engagement is male-dominated as well, that's probably not terribly helpful. So where do we go for these models then that might help and assist our understanding? Somewhat awkwardly, given the panel, I would suggest the Nordic countries. But actually this is more about ideas of total or comprehensive defence. This isn't the fact that as perhaps more socially democratic countries, they have been more aware of more wider gender integration than the UK, but rather this is about the benefit to the defence and security of the nation. Now, you know, these models are different to the UK, where I would argue at the moment, certainly the UK approach is that taxpayers outsource defence and security to the military and other security agencies, rather than engaging the whole of society in this model. The models across the Nordic region of comprehensive or total defence all differ in the detail. But as I say, they all seek to engage all of society in security and defence effort, including women. I won't mention Norway for obvious reasons, but both Denmark and Sweden have had full integration for around 30 years. And I had the pleasure to work with a Danish mechanised infantry company commander at the UK Staff College some 10 plus years ago, who just happened to be a woman. We need to actively engage with our Nordic partners, and you know, we are partners now in a number of our enterprises, and seek opportunities for both mentoring and exchange, as Eloise put it so well. Mentoring within can be quite difficult. Why don't we look to external mentoring, so that the UK can then grow its own capability in this area built on the experience of those others? As has been highlighted, Norway has already provided a 2-star UN force commander, and Australia is about to do the same. And we should seek to learn from their experience and bring that in to the UK. And then I think, building on Eloise's point, we also need to consider closely how we create the deliberate and concerted effort which has been identified not only by the Canadians but also the New Zealanders, that is really essential to create true integration. And this is not really the dull and limited discussion about fitness standards, but rather a focus on policies that make the opportunity to serve in the armed forces more attractive to women. You know, some of these are very practical issues: provision of childcare, anyone who's still serving, DHE, and the way it expects the partner to be at home to deal with problems with housing. You know, these things are you know, from the 1960s, let alone from the 21st century. However, a word of caution at the end. I think even those countries which have been proactive in integration still have relatively low representation of women as a percentage overall. We were talking about this just before. Even the Nordic countries, it's still around 15% overall representation. The UN aspires to have 20% of peacekeepers women by 2020, and on the basis that even relatively progressive countries are struggling to get beyond 15%, this is going to be a difficult target to reach without more concerted effort. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ivan. I'm really impressed, actually. We covered so much in just 30, 35 minutes. I'm going to open the floor right now to the questions. But before doing so, I'd like to say a few things. One is that about how we're going to do the questions. Please raise your hand if you have a question. There will be a roving microphone that will come from, I think, both sides. Please wait for the microphone before you start speaking. State your name and your affiliation. I know that some of you are Chatham House members, but if you have other membership, other affiliation, please state that as well. And also, please keep your questions brief. I would appreciate that. So if anyone has any burning questions, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm going to start with one question. Patricia, I see your hand. Okay.
Thank you. Patricia Lewis, Research Director for International Security at Chatham House. So thank you all for really interesting points that you make. I suppose I'm left with a number of questions, and one of them is a question we're grappling with across the board, not only in the military, but also, for example, increasing the talent pool in cybersecurity, which by all accounts should be a completely gender-neutral issue. And yet, despite the fact that women led the field in cybersecurity or cyber issues from the 1950s onwards, we're now struggling to get women into this issue. So my question really is, what is it that we can do that can bring women into the military? What is it that attracts women into the military? Because if we're still, even when we see countries like Norway, like Sweden, like Denmark, changing the way things are done within the military, fully integrating, even when you talk about 30 years in terms of other specific combat roles, we're still struggling to get women to apply. And what is it we can do better that way, do you think?
So the question is about talent management and talent seeking talent. And I think you all mentioned about the childcare as one of the examples. Are there any other things that anyone would like to address? Eloise.
Yeah, so actually I've got 2 points on this. One is that a lot of the challenges actually exist way before recruitment, pre-recruitment, and that's in schools and in the education system, which is still quite gendered. I spoke to someone in a local recruiting office, and I asked him, what are the challenges to getting more women to coming into the recruiting office in the first place? We can make all sorts of policy changes within the military, but if women don't present at the door, we can't recruit more women. And he said it's just something that schoolgirls don't have presented to them as a career opportunity. So it's engaging much earlier and further down the line. But one interesting thing to think about is actually not just thinking about the military as a homogenous mass that's male-dominated, but thinking of it as skilled trades and the labour involved in it. And if you look at the different sectors of the army, and I'm using the army specifically because that's my background, but they largely reflect society in those trades. So, for example, engineers, it's tiny. It's like 1.4% of the engineers is female, and 4% of the Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers is female. That actually reflects society because there are not very many engineers in society as a whole. If you think of infantry as manual labour, you don't find many builders who are female. But if you look at other sectors, so the medical corps, the staff and personnel services, they are around 30 to 35% female, which is much more reflective of administrative and medical roles in society. And a random statistic that I got is that 85% of dentists in the RAF are women, because dentistry is seen more typically. So how do you attract more women into the military in the first instance is addressing pre-recruitment. I'll just very quickly give a second point, which is actually some of the non-gendered policies that the military have implemented have had a gendered effect. And a couple of examples of this. So the increased reliance on reserves. If you look at the reserves, there are sectors of the reserves that are almost 20% female. If you get, I think it's majors in the reserves is about 18%, and that's because it's a much more flexible employment pattern. So the reserves, by increasing the reliance on reserves, we are actually as a whole force increasing the employment of women. The Armed Forces Redundancy Programme disproportionately fell on men. But then there are other areas where we've sought to attract engineers directly from university. Bizarrely, that's actually attracted more women into engineering within the military. So they're not gendered policies, but they've actually had a gendered impact.
Great. Any more points? Yes, Kerstin.
No, I think it has to do with the culture. The armed forces is still perceived like a kind of masculine thing that women are not so attracted to. So we need to do a lot to educate the future military leaders in order to be better to lead gender-neutral organizations. We need to have absolutely non-tolerance towards sexual harassment and bullying, because no women want to be part of an organization that is bullying. And I think we need to do something to make the armed forces more family-oriented, because it's very hard to be a soldier being deployed abroad in international operations, in combining with responsibility for children. So we need to do many things at the same time. I think it's crucial to both look at culture and education, and also at structures and family policies. Both need to be changed in order to improve the number of women, I believe.
Great.
Yes, a couple of quick observations. I think first, because you asked, why do women decide to join? I think actually they're generally the similar sort of reasons. There's a sense of duty. I mean, it's not really for me to say. I mean, you should say, really, I suppose. But speaking as my wife, it's about a sense of duty. It's about opportunities and challenges. What are the constraints? It's the sense that it's not a level playing field still, and that there are these obstructions to progress. And I think this business about the subtle policy things, is really, really important. Flexible working has been brought in, and what I've seen on flexible working, it's really not been handled terribly well, because individuals are allowed to apply for flexible working target. Certainly in the Air Force, that was the way, rather than the role being a flexible working role. So that immediately, if someone applies in a role which clearly is not suitable for flexible working, causes issues. I mentioned the Defence Housing Organisation, which still assumes that it's a nuclear family of a spouse at home who can deal with issues on housing. That's just not reality. And then the last example I gave when I was talking about this before is the cross-government barriers in some ways. I had a corporal reservist, army reservist, working for me, who was deploying to Afghanistan, and about 72 hours before she was due to deploy, the Home Office decided to pull the visa of her Canadian nanny, au pair. And despite my pleading, they just couldn't see why they should change their mind on this. Now, there's a long story which I won't bore you with, but it ended up, she deployed, it all worked out, but it shouldn't have been that way. She should not have been put through that.
Please go ahead. Let's wait. Yes, let's wait for the microphone. Yes.
John Wilson. I'm a member of this institute and of RUSI. I'm a journalist and a historian, and I've been a long-time campaigner for women's rights. I have in my archives a book written some years ago by an American Ranger captain, in which he states that the feminization of the military weakens it. Is he right?
Shall we start?
Yes, go ahead.
No, it strengthens it, because it's not about, depends what you mean by, that's feminisation being used as a pejorative term, and it's not. Contemporary conflict is incredibly complicated, and we talk about the complexity of contemporary conflict. If you can't engage with the whole of society, and you realistically can't if you only employ 50% of it, that makes no sense. Israel seems to me, and we haven't mentioned Israel, but that used to be the go-to standard. Israel seems to me to be an example of, but you've got a society which at least perceives itself to be an existential threat, and therefore manages to be integrated in a way but perhaps we, because we don't feel that existential threat, can't. So no, I think it's completely wrong. I think it's an outdated attitude, as we have heard, as I say, from a number of people in social media.
Oh, I perfectly agree. It's an outdated approach. We cannot afford not to recruit 50% of the women. Women are now at the most prestigious universities doing much better than men, at least in Norway, in most universities. And it would be a great shame if the armed forces was not to recruit from these very strong and skillful women who are now coming into society. So I think it's an outdated approach. The armed forces will improve with more women, not be less capable.
I think that in linked to that thinking, there is the view about the physical standards, the fitness standards, right? There's this discussion going on about this, whether there should be the same fitness standards for men and women. Would it take the morale down if you actually incorporate different standards for women? And that, I think, links back to that kind of this questioning of feminization of the military. Would you elaborate a little bit on that, perhaps, Eloise?
So, you know, what you're potentially suggesting there is that by introducing women, you will be reducing standards. And actually, the solution to conflict is the male standard. And so, firstly, it's long been held by the so these are the new physical employment standards that are being brought in for the combat roles, and this is as basically setting a standard that the army will not be reducing below. So the inclusion of women into combat roles in the UK military will not see a reduction in physical standards. And in fact, in the short term, I think it's seen an improvement because so long as previously the British military have hidden behind the fact that women can't do the task. Now you have to rigidly adhere to those standards, and men have to meet them too. And there are plenty of men who've joined combat roles who, over time, have failed to meet these physical standards, and now they have to. So actually, it's not going to see a reduction in quality of recruits, and actually, it's going to make sure that we rigidly adhere to those physical standards. If I can just go back to the first part of the question before. I've just returned from a UN tour in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and one of the really interesting things that I was exposed to there was a number of different nations' approach to the employment of women in their units. And at one end of the spectrum, you had a South African infantry battalion that was 20% female and commanded by a female lieutenant colonel. At the other end of the spectrum, the three largest troop-contributing countries in MONUSCO were India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And they had about 2,500 troops each, and not one of their females went out on the ground. And it really hindered their ability to operate effectively in a peacekeeping mission because they were unable to engage as successfully as the South Africans did with the local population. So just to reinforce what you're saying about feminisation decreasing the effectiveness of the military, I don't think that holds true.
Yuan, did you want to add something?
It's maybe a sort of red herring in a way, but I'm sufficiently old that I can remember exactly the same observations being made about homosexual serving. We don't even talk about it anymore. It's become a complete non-issue. It was criminal when I first commissioned. It's now a complete non-issue. And I think if we can get this integration process right, in 20 years' time, we'll be looking back on this conversation saying, what, you really had a conversation about integrating women?
Can we take, yes, lady at the back. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Claire Haller, CAS Fellow from the RAF. I joined the Air Force 32 years ago as an engineer, so firmly sit in the bracket that you've been talking about today. My experience would be that less is more, and the least times you have to draw attention to the fact that you're female, the better it is. And I do wonder the fact that we draw parallels with flexible working with women, that actually we're almost kind of, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that we're saying that that's what we have to do. We have to have those those allowances made for us when actually it shouldn't be a female issue, it should be a gender-neutral issue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the comment. Did I see a hand over there? Yes, can I also?
Hi, Lawrence Clark, also a CAS fellow, funnily enough. I just want to pick up on a point that you made, Ewan, talking about homosexuals and people based on their sexuality joining the armed forces. Are there any sort of direct parallels you could possibly bring from recruiting LGBTQ people or ethnic minorities into the gender equation as well?
Perfect, great question. Can we take these one remark and the question first, and then I'll go there. Anyone would like to highlight the gender issue from? Yeah.
I'll start because the one was thrown directly at me. So, I mean, I think the main thing is that we've gone from, as I say, from in my lifetime in the service, from criminalisation to a very positive image. I think the difficulty in terms of the comparison is we're talking about 50% of the population here. It seems uncomfortable to suggest you should even be having to push the issue of recruitment. And that's why I think Heloise's point is really important. This is, I think, much more about these subtle barriers, which takes me back to that point, which is, I don't think the subtle barriers are so much, I mean, yes, in that they crop up in this conversation, because they're quite often about families. I have a number of neighbours now where it's the wife that is serving, and that was not the case 30 years ago. And the husband that is a civilian. That wasn't the case 30 years ago. It was 180 degrees reverse. In fact, if you got pregnant in the Air Force when we were first commissioned, you were asked to leave. That's how things have changed. So I don't think it's a case, and I absolutely get your experience of less is more, but that should not stop us trying to make it as easy, if that's the right word, in terms of these subtle obstructions for people to serve as we possibly can, because it affects both genders, and I think that's almost Heloise's point.
I'd like to say too that family-oriented policy is not only for women; it's for both for men and women. And in a society where both men and women work, we have to have a society that is. That have kindergartens and that have established structures that enable both women and men to work. And also in the armed forces, we need a policy for family-oriented policy that would benefit both genders, not only women. And that is something we need to strive to reach.
Perfect. Can I, if you don't have anything to add, can I go there? I think there are a few. Can I get the two over there and maybe a third question afterwards?
Good afternoon, Chris Webber, Royal Marines. Given that a large portion of our serving service population have served alongside women on the front line in Iraq and Afghanistan, why has the counter-narrative to women in ground close combat not been comprehensively defeated? And what more can people such as myself, who will be now fronting this policy change to their junior Marines, do?
Lady next to, yes.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Marcia Henry. I'm from the Center for Women, Peace and Security. It kind of links with a couple of questions, but it's really about whether you think that the argument, the fairly instrumentalist argument about women contributing to operational effectiveness has any more life in it, because if research showed that women did not contribute to operational effectiveness, would we reverse all of this progress that we've made in terms of integrating women? So I'm just wondering what your feedback is on that.
Can we take the third question as well? When I come back to the stage, perhaps you can take which question you would like to address, because we have 10 minutes.
I'm Brigadier Krishnan from the High Commission of India. I would like to know whether any studies have been done on employment of women in ground combat roles as well as in the armed forces in Asia and Africa. And second, there has been a debate in UK on the impact on musculoskeletal issues, employing women in the armed forces. Has the debate been settled? Thank you.
Did I see a hand at the background there, or yes? let's take your question as well, and then.
Hi, Nick Pett from the UK Ministry of Defence. I'm just wondering, because the pace of change has been mentioned a couple of times, whether you think we've got time to wait, because I'm noting the fact that you mentioned 30 years ago there was a good level of integration in the RAF, but still on the ACSC there's only 14% attendance of women. We're nowhere near having a first woman as CDS. Do we have time to wait, given the challenges we're facing? Thank you.
Perfect. Who would like to start first? Maybe from either Kirsty or Louise this time? Yeah,
I'll
Louise.
start. There were a lot of questions there, so I might just pick a couple off. I'm just going to go to the Royal Marine first. So my first tour of Afghanistan was early 2009, and I was there when the Royal Marines handed over to their subsequent brigade who took over from them. And interestingly, there was this sort of in-joke within 3 Commando Brigade headquarters whereby you didn't want a woman turning up to take over your job because that meant your job could be done by a woman. And I think I would be quite confident in thinking that doesn't persist anymore. And the reason I would think so is because Iraq and Afghanistan hugely evolved the perception of the employment of women in the army, much in the same way the employment of women by the military evolved during the Second World War when we needed them. I think the only way that you really break down these barriers is actually just by proving it. And that's quite difficult because you're basically asking women to do something extra, and that's prove their worth. But it's very difficult for men to have a different view other than have it demonstrated for them. So when I got to ICSC, I felt no different treatment from my male colleagues on that course. But that experience early on in my career definitely demonstrated that there was some legacies. But I think the role of women in Iraq and Afghanistan has hugely advanced that. The other one I will actually just very quickly pick up is the point about the pace of change. You cannot accelerate the pace of change any quicker than the promotion system within the military. So when I was at school, the army was still largely closed to women. It was only in, I think it was 1999, just after I'd left school, that the engineers, the REME, and the artillery opened up to women. And indeed, my school, the RAF came and recruited. And when I got to the 6th form, I wrote my name down on a piece of paper to go and have an interview, and I was told it was for the men only. And that is how long it takes for people to come through the system. You can't increase it any faster because women genuinely just haven't had the opportunity to come through. So ACSC is only 14% because 16, 17 years ago when those women were joining the army, that's how few the numbers were. But it will come through, and I'm very much against the positive discrimination to change that number because that will not help the women themselves either.
Okay. Is it?
Yeah, that's
fine.
Yeah. There were so many questions. I think I'll just focus on the one behind. Do we have time to wait? I'm a very impatient person, and when we look at the figures from Norway, the increase of female conscripts has increased in 3 years from 12-13% till 26% in 2.5-3 years. And that's, we have done that without any quotas. We do not quote in women. We want the most motivated and the best suited because we only take 10,000 out of 60,000 conscript or young people. I think I'm really positive that if we are able to keep quite a large portion of these 26% conscripts, we are on the right path. We see the numbers are increasing. They are slowly increasing. It takes time. Culture takes time to change. And this is actually a cultural change that needs to be done because armed forces has been for so many years identified so strongly with men and masculinity. So it doesn't happen like this, but we need to be impatient. We need to have structures there to help us, but I don't think we should have quotas either. I don't think we should quote in women because that would not be beneficial for the status of women in the armed forces. But I see a positive change, and I choose to be quite optimistic now.
Perfect. You want?
I'm going to come back to you, Nick, in a minute anyway. So I'll pick up the two that haven't been picked.
You have 2 minutes. You have 2
Got
minutes.
it, but I can pick up the couple that haven't been mentioned so far. Marsha, no, we're not. The instrumentalist argument is simply there because it adds weight to the argument. Yes, the argument that you should be representative of the population should be enough, but actually I think the instrumentalist argument just adds more weight to it. If it's taken away, it doesn't mean the argument is any less valid. With regards to studies in Africa and Asia, I'm not particularly aware of any on Asian armed forces, but certainly I have seen them on African armed forces, coming out primarily out of ISS in Pretoria, where they have looked at a number of examples of where, the example of the South African battalion being a classic case in point. To Nick's point about accelerating the pace of change, no, I'm not in favour of positive discrimination either. However, I do think we can be creative in our thinking. The UK is increasingly looking at the role for re-entrants. Now, I would guarantee if you looked at it, one of the reasons we only have 14% of women at Staff College is because a number of them have left in the intervening years, perhaps to have families. What we ought to be doing is creating incentives to allow them, as their children get older, as childcare becomes more available, or they have a different appetite and willingness to make those re-entrant possibilities greater. Certainly I know the Air Force is looking at you can re-enter at a higher rank than the one you left at. Which is, I have to say, in some ways quite attractive, in other ways, you're never going back there again. But I think if that was focused in a gender positive way, not a positive discrimination way, those are not the same things, then I think that would be an opportunity to perhaps hasten some of that change.
Perfect, great timing. It is 2 p.m. Now I have to close the session, but I would like to thank the speakers and also the audience to make the event fruitful. Thank you very much for coming.